Hello and welcome to I Miss Book Club. I'm Veronica Reynolds, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host Dana Munch.
Hello.
And this week we're talking about what even is literary fiction, which we're talking about because Dana's book club is technically a literary fiction book club. Chapters covers literary fiction. So a lot of the books that we are going to be talking about through this podcast are classified by the publisher, usually is where that definition comes from, as literary fiction. But what does that even mean?
Does anyone know?
Does anyone know? It's history. So I read a bunch of articles in preparation for this, and most of them made me vaguely angry because the interesting thing I would say about us as a duo is Dana's running a literary book club, literary fiction book club, and reads a lot of literary fiction in your spare time, right? That's your
Yes.
go-to. Whereas I'm a genre reader. And I very rarely read literary fiction, which is why we thought it would be a fun pairing for us to talk about these books. But almost inevitably, unless it's an author who reads primarily genre fiction, every article about what literary fiction is vaguely insulting to genre fiction.
Yes. I actually came across the same thing, and I also found it interesting that so many of the things I was reading were more about what literary fiction is not versus what it actually is.
Right, exactly. And I think that's because every definition also comes with this caveat that it's really fluid. So I think it's useful to do a little background on how literary fiction came to be. Because at one point, the early 1700s or so, fiction started to be a thing. Robinson Crusoe is pointed out as one of the earliest novels. Obviously, Don Quixote is the first novel in the Western world. We're talking about Western literature. The idea of the novel was a genre in and of itself. Like the idea of fiction was a genre, and it was considered a pretty dangerous one for ladies. They might read it, and their little
All
heads.
those well-read women.
Oh yeah, they were. The novel was like junk TV. That like when you read about characters who read novels in books in contemporary books of the time, they're very dismissive. Um,
Hmm.
the novel gives you romantic notions, which is very dangerous.
Yeah, and I think it's also this idea that you're not like studying something, you're not like learning some sort of hard and fast subject matter while you're reading, frivolous fiction.
Right. And I think, as always, as we see through history, things that are scorned are generally things that women are interested in, which I think is interesting when it comes to genre versus literary fiction, because we see as fiction develops and breaks into genres, the scorned genres tend to be things that are considered women's literature. Romance novels primarily are the
Yes.
ones that have retained this kind of, you know, dirty, bad fiction aura, which is such a shame because romance novels are so fascinating as a genre. And there's books that are held up now as literary fiction that follow every romance convention there is.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people who read fiction, I mean, that read romance novels are like reluctant to admit it, or if they do, they're sort of like, "Oh, I just wanted something fun," or they seem to want to like provide you with some sort of qualifier about why they are reading romance, which is, a shame, I think. Like you shouldn't have to feel badly about anything that you're reading. And I think it just speaks to this overarching perception of like who romance novels are for and like what they are.
And it is also attached to this other interesting thing of money, because what I often saw genre fiction linked to in all these articles was commercial fiction. This idea that it's written to
I
be
saw that too.
consumed and make money, which I find very funny because this seems to travel across every art form, which is this idea that, like, if you want to eat and you produce things that will make sure that you can eat, that you are somehow lesser than if you are just
You are a
acting like
sellout.
a parrot, like very aesthetically starving to death for your art.
Yeah, that is a great point because I totally agree. It's like if you're making money, you're somehow a sellout or you're like undermining your own creativity in favor of the almighty dollar, like these weird notions.
I took a writing class years ago. Really nice group of people. I had a great time. but I had written something and they're like, it really feels like you wrote this so that someone would buy it. And I'm like, yes,
Really?
correct. That is what I would
Shocking.
ultimately like to happen here. I think once money gets involved, it's like it's the same thing as femininity getting involved. There's like a dirty stink. Oh no, it's been touched by
Yeah.
capitalism, as if we can write somehow in a void where that isn't the system of governance that we're living in, you know.
Right.
Um, but one of the big things, to back off a little bit and be maybe a little bit more generous, that I did see across pretty much every article was one of the big things they used to define literary fiction is that it followed character over plot, which really tied back into what we talked about with the four doorways. Um,
Yes.
and that there is a sense that one of the big complaints about literary fiction is often that it's kind of plotless or meandering. I was thinking about that book you were talking about, The Idiot, which after you told me about, like, how like you don't notice doors unless you're shopping for doors. It's my mom's favorite
Yes.
metaphor. After you mentioned it, I literally like an hour later read an article talking about the fact that she's writing a sequel about her sophomore year of
Yes.
college.
Yes. I am looking forward to it.
But you may even have mentioned it, but I also read it. It was just a very confluence of moments. But um, I just thought that was so interesting because I don't know how true that is, even. I mean, I guess most literary fiction is character driven, but I don't know if it's all plotless. I mean, quite a lot of it.
No, I would argue that it's not. I think there certainly are plots. I that idea of like this plotless fiction that I said that I like. I actually find it almost difficult to find something like when I find that I'm excited about it because I don't actually see it that much. And certainly, what we read in chapters is, uh, you know, definitely has some sort of plot because we have things to talk about and a story to follow. I don't think that idea of something plotless appeals to everyone, and I'm not sure that I would really choose it as a choice for my particular book club. I'm not sure that my attendees would find that enjoyable. I think most people want some semblance of a plot.
You need something, right? Because how does the character change and develop if there's
Right.
literally zero action? I mean, it doesn't have to be big action, but I think that what they were talking about, what comes through in a lot of these articles, is like, well, genre fiction follows predictable beats. They
Hmm.
keep calling out romance novels because obviously with romance, the point is that the couple or however many people are involved, because romance is an evolving genre, but how, wind up together in the end.
Right. You need the happily ever after.
Right. But to me, I'm like, yeah, but I mean, there's a million stories in that. And
Yeah.
certainly I've read lots of literary fiction where the main thrust is romantic.
Yeah. Definitely.
So I thought that was interesting. And I think what's hard with that is they keep trying to tie science fiction and horror and fantasy into that same thing. And I'm like, I find that I just wonder if they have given these genres a chance, because maybe if you're talking about like Tolkien era fantasy where like there's like five people actively, like the fantasy novel is a relatively new
Yeah.
idea. Um, you know, so yes, it is kind of this high fantasy thing, but fantasy is such a huge genre with so many different kinds of stories being told. And science fiction's kind of notorious for exactly what they're claiming literary fiction does, which is examining life. They're just
Yeah.
removing you from your situation. I found such a good quote. It's from an author I don't particularly like, but he not to call him out, Lev Grossman's a great author. He's just not for me personally. He wrote The Magicians, which was one of these really big hits. Novels aren't status symbols, or they shouldn't be. Maybe it's the last vestiges of our Puritan heritage. If it's not hard work, it's sinful. Maybe it's just that we're self-loathing capitalists, and anything associated with commerce, as genre fiction is automatically tainted and disqualified from having any aesthetic value. And I was like,
Whoa.
damn, you nailed it, Lev.
Hard hitting.
Well, because Lev Grossman is this interesting author. I don't particularly love his books, but I totally get why people do. They made a whole television series out of The Magicians. And The Magicians is like this really fascinating kind of merge of a Catcher in the Rye kind of storyline meets like the darkest possible version of Harry Potter.
Okay.
Because his main character is kind of like a depressive guy who it's really the world that he's obsessed with is really more Narnia like. He loves these books that are very Narnia adjacent. Um, but ultimately he gets into magical grad school. So instead of it being like a kid, he's like in his early 20s, I think. And he gets invited into this magical world and he goes to magical grad school, but it's like super hard. People die. It's like really rough and human. And you can find the magicians in a lot of libraries sitting on the regular fiction shelves, even though it's very clearly fantasy.
I am thinking about the Night Circus
Yes,
and
which we
how
talked about.
that, yeah, I think we talked about it last time, but I think that also is in like a regular fiction section of the library, even though it is very clearly fantastical in nature.
Right. So I think to talk about this stuff, we have to talk about this gray area that drives me insane called magical realism.
Oh, yeah, I know.
So, magical realism, if you're not familiar, is a word that we put to books where they don't define the magic system, essentially. This is one of the articles I was reading talked about this, and I was like, that's a pretty good definition. So, like, it's
Yeah,
a
I
book,
haven't heard that before,
but I think
but
that's
it
what it
makes
means.
perfect sense. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a fantasy element or a magical element that is not explained or reasoned with. The one I always think of is The Particular Sadness of Lemon Cake by Amy Bender.
That's it. Yes.
Okay. um Basically the main character can taste emotions of the people who made the food. And what makes it magical realism instead of a fantasy novel is that it's never explained how she's able to do this. It's just kind of weaved in. Gabrielle Marquez does this a lot. It's like a very
Yeah.
popular thing. Like
Alice Hoffman.
yeah, 100 Years of Solitude has tons of magical realism in it, as opposed to like a fantasy book where they will explain the magical system. There's rules that have to be followed, and it is like a major part of the book explaining the system of magic. But ultimately, to me, what it usually is a way to be like, we can put this on the shelves with literary fiction
Right. Like
because
this is a
it's
serious magical book.
right. And again, I think that becomes so mixed. And I think another one that gets really thrown on the under the bus because of that is horror. Because I will say I have read literary fiction that has left me way more sleepless than any horror novel I've ever read.
Yeah.
Pretty horrific things happen in literary fiction. So much sexual assault. I think like that's like one of the things I will say, like sexual
Right.
assault.
Domestic violence galore. Like,
Right. All of that seems to make you literary fiction. And then you have these outlying books, which you think should be literary fiction. They follow all the definition trends, but they make too much money to be literary fiction. Like the one that comes to mind is Jodi Picoult. Like Jodi Picoult
yeah.
has all the hallmarks of literary fiction, but I think everyone would call her popular fiction.
Right. Yeah. Or women's fiction, which is like the other thing
Yeah, that
that
I will say, in fairness, I don't hear the words women's fiction as often anymore.
yeah, I think that there is a move away from it. But certainly when I was in graduate school, it is like something that we talked about. And I was like, this doesn't make any sense. But there does seem to be a movement of like rejoining women authors with like the overarching label of literary fiction, which
Yeah,
lends a certain prestige. Um, but like, at some point that term meant like you have a woman character worried about woman things and it's written by a woman. So this is clearly just for women to read, which is a
very
very
much.
silly idea.
And what it really makes me think of, and I know you've had this experience, I can't think of many public librarians who haven't, is when somebody comes in, a parent, and says, "My son never reads. He doesn't like books. Please recommend something." And then you'll recommend a book and said, "Oh, he won't read something where the main character is a girl." And
Yeah.
it's such a moment because you're like, okay, but books build empathy. That's how we get there. And I don't know, I think Hunger Games is for everyone. It's not a
I was
particularly feminine
just going to
book.
mention Hunger Games because I think it is something that appeals to genders pretty equally, and like very clearly the main character is a woman. So
But Katniss isn't sitting around like braiding her hair, you know what I mean?
right,
She's
right,
like
right, yeah.
worried about getting her period. She's like murdering people. I'm like, I feel like everyone can get on this.
Yeah,
Um, her
agreed.
worries are the worries of anyone living in a dystopian society. I had something else highlighted that I thought was okay. So this is from the New York book editors, which I loved because they break it down. They're one of the ones who's like, okay, literary fiction is character focused. I loved this one. Literary fiction often has an ambiguous ending, and I'm like, is that true?
Is that true?
I don't know. Question mark
That's
forever.
true.
I don't know that that's true.
I,
But this
I
was
think
my
if you take this idea very literally that literary fiction is about characters only and like doesn't really have a plot, then of course you would wind up at an ambiguous ending because you're just like immersed in the internal world of this particular character. But like we said at the outset, I don't really think that literary fiction is plotless. And sure, like sometimes you get a cliffhanger or, you know, but all kinds of books end in all kinds of ways. So I find this a very weird statement to make.
what's great is they followed up with a statement that I totally agree with. Not sure if it should be true, but it totally is. Literary fiction is award friendly.
Yes, it is actually, and like I think I came across a lot is that like, oh, literary fiction is a prestige category, and like if you're a literary author, your books are printed in hardcover immediately, and like other things of that nature. But of course, yeah, and of course, like they have more eyes on them, so they're more likely to get awards, I think.
And I also think what's interesting is as an author, you can become marked as a literary fiction author no matter what you write. So have like, for instance, you have Kazuo Ishiguro who writes Remains of the Day, which we read for our on one book, and wins 1,000 awards. It's totally literary fiction as defined by all of these articles. It's character driven, very little happens. It tells you a lot about the human condition, all of this stuff. And Ishiguro goes on to write in like 37 different genres. Like none of his books have been in the same genre. He's written science fiction. I believe he's written what's essentially a fantasy novel. Excuse me, I haven't read it yet. But he's written more than one science fiction book. But he is a literary fiction author, and all of his books are treated as if they're literary fiction. Now, they may wind up in the sci-fi section of a bookstore or something like that, but
Right.
they get literary fiction covers, which I find interesting.
Yes, I was just gonna say because he also wrote Clara and the Sun, which is about like artificial intelligence, and so it's sort of like a sci-fi dystopian book. But you were absolutely correct; it has a very like literary fiction cover, meaning this particular cover is like red. It has a very simplistic hand on it with a sun, and like that's it. It's very like minimal, but yeah, it's still like, oh, this is literary fiction. Like even on Goodreads, it has a tag of literary fiction
Does it? Isn't it funny?
alongside science fiction, fantasy, dystopia, speculative fiction. I'm like, contemporary. How do you have all of these on one book?
Because it's just who Ishiguro is as an author, right? Like another
Right.
one of my, and I love her, Margaret Atwood, has just
Yes.
written straight up science fiction. And it's still, we have it because, so something to note with library classification, we tend to keep all an author's books together because we assume that's how you find your next book, right? Like if you like an author, you don't want to
Yeah.
split.
Yeah. Agreed.
So
Like
Atwood,
logistically, it makes sense.
right. I remember when Atwood's, she had this trilogy, a dystopian trilogy.
Mad Adam
Yes, Mad Adam.
trilogy because I loved it. Yes,
It was
but
fabulous.
it's totally
It's
sci-fi.
so sci-fi. And I remember Nancy, who collects our regular fiction, and Karen O, who collects our fantasy, sci-fi, and horror under the speculative fiction umbrella, having like a real debate about where these books should go. Because Nancy's point was, well, all the other Atwood books are upstairs in our regular fiction because we do have what I like to think of as a speculative fiction ghetto. where everything is
Yeah, right.
off. And I'm fine with that, by the way, just to be clear, because I think that that group of readers appreciates having their books separated out. They can find them just like
Yeah.
romance authors. I'm not saying that everything should be all mixed up necessarily, but I do think it's very funny that won't be true when we're done with our renovation, but right now, all of our genre fictions in the basement and all of our regular fictions on the top floor.
You know what? I never thought about it, but it is absolutely like that, and the implications are funny in a
Mystery is
way.
upstairs. I will say mystery is a weird genre in that it is very rarely considered literary fiction. But one of the reasons we thought about this was because the book we talked about last was definitely literary fiction that had a big mystery plot line.
Right.
Um, but mystery gets a little more prestige. Like, I don't think mystery readers get the same side eye that sci-fi, fantasy, romance, and horror readers get necessarily.
No, I don't think so either. I would agree with you. Something I was thinking I'm circling back a little bit, but something I was thinking about before is when you were talking about how the genre fiction has like really specific rules for it. And I find it so strange because particularly something like fantasy or science fiction is like the point is to imagine things that do not exist and therefore are completely endless. Like you can just dream up anything and put it into a book. So the idea that there are like rules to it seems very weird to me.
So one of the big things with with fantasy and sci-fi and horror, it's not that there's rules on how to write them, but they have to be internally consistent.
Oh, right.
So
Yeah.
like um in Narnia, right, when we're talking about like C.S. Lewis books, um you can have talking animals, like that's totally fine because they're imbued with that ability. But if the objects start talking, you have to explain that because it's not internally consistent. Do you know what I'm saying?
Then it becomes magical realism. No, I'm just
Because yes,
kidding.
if the cat talks to you, it's magical realism. If the cat talks to you, it's fantasy. So
Yeah.
many talking cats in fantasy books, but yeah, there has to be like an
Yes,
internal.
I get what you're saying. Like
Um,
it is like the rules of the universe versus like the book.
right, and if you're, what can take you out of a genre book really fast is if the main character becomes overpowered and can break the rules of the universe as they've been laid out. So,
Mm.
like one of my favorite genre books that I've read recently, I have it right here so I can be sure I get the author right, is Hench by Natalie Zena Walshatz. So Hench, it's a fabulous book. Um, it's about a woman who is barely eking by doing scut work for villains. So it's a world where superheroes and supervillains are real, but she's a temp. She's a hench temp. She's a hench person temp. She's really good with spreadsheets. And one of the superheroes defeats her boss and shoves her out of the way, and he has super strength, and it breaks her hip. And she's laid up, she can't work. And she realizes as she gets like more and more bitter about this situation, she doesn't have like good health care, all of this stuff, is that like superheroes do way more damage than supervillains do. Like there's all this peripheral damage that they do. And she winds up working for a supervillain because she starts a blog complaining and breaking down, because she's good with spreadsheets, all the money that they're costing citizens in damages. But it's a very internally consistent book. Magic never happens. You know what I mean? Like
Right.
nothing ever like deus ex machinas. And what's one of the things that makes it really delightful to read is the world feels very real because it's the reality created in the world's never broken. And magical realism definitely doesn't hold the same way because the magic that happens in magical realism is never scrutinized, right? It's just kind of a
Right. Yeah, in my experience, like I haven't read a ton of magical realism. There's been a few things, and it's almost like something happens with no like explanation, and you almost get the feeling that you're supposed to be like, did that really happen? Did it not happen? Was it a figment of their imagination? Is this like a miracle that occurred? There's like other underlying questions that happen because there is no explanation for it.
well, it oddly ties into that definition of literary fiction that it has an ambiguous ending. It has an ambiguous
Yeah, right.
magic system. I love 100 Years of Solitude. It's a beautiful book, but yeah, like things just kind of happen. And what's weird about them is they're not always fully acknowledged by the other characters in the book. which
Yeah.
can feel like very disassociated if you're in the wrong frame of mind when you're reading. I have another Lev Grossman quote because he is a one heck of a writer. So he has this thing about genre fiction that I thought was really great that kind of dovetails off what we're talking about. When you read genre fiction, you leave behind the problems of reality, but only to re encounter those problems in a transfigured form, in an unfamiliar guise, one that helps you understand them more completely and feel them more deeply. Genre fiction isn't just generic pap. You don't read it to escape your problems, you read it to find a new way to come to terms with them.
Hmm.
And like that to me is like the beauty of a piece of genre fiction is that it can remove a single problem out of its context and reframe it. I think that's why we're like really obsessed with the idea of artificial intelligence. And like,
Yeah.
because what we're really asking there is like, what makes someone a human being? Like, that's like one of the, like, I think solid questions that runs through tons of science fiction is like, what makes a person a person?
Yeah. So a conversation that I've had with someone in my own life. So like I read so much like contemporary realism, literary fiction type books, and he reads almost exclusively science fiction, fantasy. And the arguments that we have are like I like to read about things that are like feel real to me, and that are like relevant to my own life and looking at the human condition that way, whereas he prefers to he's like I've had enough of life and I'm not like escaping it, but I just want to look through it through this other lens that is or can be like more imaginative, um and is not so like close to home in that in the way of it being like quote unquote real, but the issues are still very much the same.
I think it's that old saying, wherever you go, there you are. You can put humans in space,
Yeah.
you can put them on the back of a unicorn, but our problems are still the same. Like humanity's issues. Like what is a fantasy novel but a book about battling evil most of the time? Which is something
Hmm.
we all kind of do in our day-to-day lives. It's just less exciting and also not as clear.
Hmm.
I think what genre fiction can often serve up is a little more clarity. You kind of know what good and evil look like, and they have very clear names. Not so much in contemporary stuff that plays around with it more, but like Neil Gaiman, who's quoted a lot in these articles. Like I'm looking at one of his books, Good Omens, where like the joke is the angel and the demon are like just kind of normal people, and they're not very good at their jobs, you know. But it's the issues are clear. You're trying to stop the apocalypse. Obviously, the end of the world is bad.
Right.
Not to
Yeah.
quote a Marvel movie, but like, why do you want to save the universe? Because I'm one of the losers who lives in it. It's like a pretty cut and dry situation, which I know literary fiction's less thrilled about. I do have one of my in this list. I'm really loving this New York book editors list. Literary fiction may be difficult to read. Stories that explore the
Hmm.
human condition aren't exactly fun reads. By nature, they have to deal with difficult subject matter with unflinching honesty. It can be a tad
I
uncomfortable
hate
to
it.
think about these issues when you, as the reader, simply want to escape. Literary fiction may rely on symbolism or allegory, because there's no symbolism or allegory in genre fiction. In
Definitely. Oh
deeper
my
meaning,
god.
like literally the whole point of science fiction is that it is an allegory.
This
There's
is
almost
a
always,
wild statement.
isn't it great?
Uh, I hate it.
I knew you would. I saved it just for you.
It's like, oh my gosh. I mean, we've sort of talked about how like genre fiction is looked down upon, but this is really egregious in a way that is totally unfair. Um, just from like a very like logistical standpoint, if you were entering like a fantasy world, you got to learn all new stuff about that world and all the characters and how it works and all those things. That alone makes it not an easy read
No, if you've ever picked up
from the
Tolkien for the
outset.
first time, I mean, I'm looking at my copy of Lord of the Rings, which is like 10 inches thick. Good
Yeah,
luck.
right. Like, wow, wow.
Well, I think also, too, part of that comes from that snobbery of difficult means good. And
Yeah,
I won't name names here because we're not here to like disrespect authors, even though I've been less than kind to Lev Grossman, which is not fair. It's just that his books just aren't for me. He's a great author. He's just not for me. I don't like Catcher in the Rye either. I'm a bad librarian. But where was I going? Oh yeah, not to disrespect anyone, but there are authors who are under the literary fiction umbrella who are best-selling authors, and I find their books difficult to read because I think they're not very good.
Yeah, I mean, that's the other thing is like I think that people are more willing to say that they like quote unquote understood a book even if they didn't, or liked a book or an author even if they didn't, if it's literary fiction, because it lends them this credibility of being a serious reader and some sort of intellectual, that I don't think is like a fair assessment necessarily based on that alone.
Absolutely. The book that comes to mind, and again, this is not bashing it because I haven't personally made it through it, but the book that I think of the most when we talk about this stuff is Infinite Jest,
Mm.
because Infinite Jest has this very big intellectual cachet attached to it. Um, and it is a difficult to read book. See, I have never finished it.
Yeah,
I don't
I
mind
feel like
admitting
few
it.
people have.
And, there is this kind of like winner status almost attached to like really enjoying it and getting something out of it. And that's great. I mean, I'm sure it's a great book. It's just to me, there's this, I don't think accessibility should be the measurement of quality. Because to me, I think great writers make difficult things accessible. That's the whole point. You want people to read the book, ideally.
That's an excellent point. Yeah, and I think it also takes like a certain type of person to be able to take something that's complex and make it accessible for other people, like being able to synthesize ideas in a way that are more understanding for other people means that you yourself probably understand them to some degree, to be able to break it down.
I was reading this thing the other day, unrelated to literacy, but it made me think of this. They said you really are only an expert in a subject if you can accurately explain it and have a 5-year-old understand. Because you
Mm,
have to break it down to its component parts, right?
yeah.
Not to say that you have to explain astrophysics to a 5-year-old, but like you should be able to boil it down in a way that is graspable. And there's no shame in making something simpler so someone can wrestle with it. I think books should be available for everyone. And making something complicated because you think it makes it more prestigious is such an odd choice. There's this, okay, so I will say one author that I don't like because he's very dead and I don't think he'll care. I don't like James Joyce. I'm just calling myself out. People are gonna be like,
Oh,
anti-intellectual librarian doesn't
what?
like James Joyce or Catcher in the Rye. I'm a genre reader. If you want to qualify me as a less than reader, that's fine. I don't like James Joyce that much. And James Joyce had this quote, and I'm assuming he actually said this. He may not have, but it feels real. Let's put it that way. Um, he said, "The book took me 7 years to write. It should take you 7 years to read." And I'm like, that
Oh,
is not how
uh,
anything works. That's not the point. We shouldn't be reading your labor minute by minute. I don't think that's how anything works. If you love James Joyce, that's great. I totally get why people like him. He's just not, again, just not for me. Um, but I just was like, I think there are some authors and more than the authors. I don't really want to blame authors. There's some publishers that really feel that way, you know?
well, one of the things that I came across when I was like reading about literary fiction and what qualifies was like this idea of style being like a major component of literary fiction, which, the point that like I think you could be have style like styled writing and genre fiction aside, I think style like becomes code for like using a lot of thesaurus words.
SAT
Like,
words. I always think of them as SAT
yeah, and
words.
like ooh, I have really complicated sentence structure and like all this other stuff that makes it like in some cases really like overwritten and I feel unnecessary at times. Of course, like you do end up sometimes with like really beautiful prose and things like that, which is excellent. But then sometimes it does come off as very like try hard. And I'm like, you could have just said it was a tree. I didn't need 4 paragraphs about this tree. Um, but yeah, I think it just speaks to this idea that they're like purposely made to be what they think is complicated, which is such a subjective term to begin with. So I'm not. always clear on what the point is, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, and yeah, there's books I've read that were difficult to read that I found really satisfying, but usually, like, to be fair, like what this article said, it's usually the subject matter that's difficult. But
Mhm.
I don't think that literary fiction has to be unfun. I thought that was because their whole point is that because the point before that one was that literary fiction is about the human condition, and they're like stories that explore the human condition aren't exactly fun reads, and I'm like, I don't think that's universally true. I mean, I'm really beating on this article. They're not like saying like this is always the case. To be fair to them, but I'm kind of pulling them up as like a straw man, I suppose. But I don't think that's fair because I think there's parts of the human condition that are really fun, and there are things that we really like to read. I think there's moments in literary fiction books that I've read that are really joyous and about breaking free. Um, this book, there. Have you ever read a book that you didn't like, but it just sticks to you like glue for like the rest of your life?
Yep.
So there's this book. I listened to the audiobook of it because I was commuting at the time, and it has to be about 15 years ago. It was called Cover the Butter. And it's definitely literary fiction. And it's, just kind of like this kind of downtrodden woman, and she gets married to a guy she doesn't really like, and yada yada. But it's got this very triumphant ending, which is why I think it stuck with me. And I'm like, that's cool to read, though. It's cool to read about somebody growing as a person and succeeding. I don't think that every literary fiction book has to be a downer. I don't think that's the case, and I think it does a disservice to the genre actually to imply that. Um,
I would agree totally. Like you said, like the human condition includes good things, um, and I do think those things show up in books, and they're like fun to read about or like feel good to read about. Yeah, like to suggest that they're all like depressing, you know,
yeah,
stories is
yeah.
unfair. Yeah.
Like, I don't know. It just seems like a shame to me because a lot of literary fiction is about love and friendship. And I'm looking at this one that I have on my shelf, which I thought was so great. Transistor Radio, which is about this young girl whose mother's boyfriend transitions and becomes a woman, and it's about her relationship with this new woman in her life as a young girl. And it's such a beautiful book, and it's such a happy, joyous book. Just hard to find. It was pre 2005, I think it came out. It was hard to find books that had transgender
Oh.
narratives that were upbeat. I love that book. And it's definitely literary fiction. You wouldn't say it was anything else, but it's got this really joyous feel. It's a coming, because I always feel like what falls into literary fiction is coming of age, right? And coming of age books can be happy. Like growing up is not necessarily a
Yes.
death sentence, you
Right.
know?
And like obviously a book needs some obstacles to
Sure.
be a story. So you're gonna have some resistance, but that's just I mean, it's just part of life. So it just makes sense to be in a book about people.
Right.
But it doesn't need to be the main thing. And it also doesn't need to be like a crushing emotional problem.
So to be fair to New York book editors and to bring us too close because we've run way over our usual amount of time because we had a lot to say about this, I feel like there might be a part two to this down the line.
Just rant forever.
Yeah, but to be fair to the New York book editors, they end with this. So literary fiction provides a fresh way to tell stories and it ignores standard formulas. It stands alone and is not scared. I kind of liked that. I don't love that it's implying that other books are somehow frightened, but I do like this idea that it stands for kind of a fearless writing about
Hmm.
life. I think that's kind of cool. Um, did you have a final thought?
I'm like mulling it over in my mind. Yeah, I don't like disagree with it. And I get what you're saying too, of like taking a hard look at like life stuff. I'm like running out of words for how to, to
No,
describe,
I hear you,
like
and like I think we've talked this to death. I think we've made both of our feelings really clear. And just to qualify, I do read literary fiction sometimes, and I do often enjoy it. I think there's books for every reader, and I don't think anyone is lesser for what they're reading. And I think you can extract the human condition from anything written by a human.
Yeah, for sure. And like I guess the thing I was thinking about is that like if you write in one of these other genres, like a lot of times I think you're sort of like stripping away things to look at something more clearly and then building up around it too,
Yeah.
which is something that I was mulling over in my period of silence that just happened.
It's okay. We all
Um,
need to take time to think, and have
yeah.
our moments. That would be a great literary fiction moment. She sat thinking about.
Yeah, right. It's like staring into space.
Well, I think we can leave this one here, but
I
I
think
have a
so.
feeling we're going to come back around and mention this only 37 to 47 more times over the
At
next
least.
several months. But what are you reading in for chapters next? What can we look forward to discussing next?
So next we are reading Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell, which is a more recent book, and it is actually about like Shakespeare's family. So um, and it's mostly about the fact that like he has a son named Hamnet who dies as a child, and so it's about like what happens to his marriage, going through grief. And in the book, Shakespeare is actually never mentioned, and because it's told from his wife's point of view, and it's kind of like, oh, her husband has this stage play, etc. So it's very clear about who it is, but he is not the main character, and it's more about like the family and going through grief, and you know and yeah, so also starting in June, we are meeting at Street Community Center rather than on Zoom, which is exciting. Um, yeah, second Tuesday every month, 7 o'clock.
Yeah, we probably should mention that like maybe more often than we have been about that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Well, I will say thank you so much, Dana. Another wonderful discussion. I'm going to be thinking about this one for a while, even after we walk away.
I'm sure I will have more complaints to come, but for another day.
So thanks everybody for listening, and we will talk to you soon. Have a great day.